France, 1944. The air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and distant gunpowder. Somewhere near the churning front lines, General Dwight D. Eisenhower stepped out of his staff car. His mission: inspect forward positions, get a real feel for the brutal advance. The road beneath his polished boots was a quagmire of churned mud, and the deep rumble of artillery was a constant, unsettling heartbeat in the distance. Ahead, a scene of typical wartime struggle unfolded. A group of GIs, their faces smudged with grime and exhaustion, wrestled with a stuck half-track. Among them, a figure stood out, an officer, his uniform as muddy as the men's, a helmet pulled low, hands thick with grease. He was locked in a heated argument with a sergeant, clearly convinced he knew the proper way to winch the vehicle out of its muddy trap. Eisenhower, ever the picture of command, walked past, heading towards what he assumed was the nearby command post. But then he stopped. A voice, something about the familiar cadence, the forceful tone, snagged his attention. He turned back. The muddy officer looked up, wiping a smear of grease from his brow. Eisenhower's eyes widened. It was unmistakable. George S. Patton. Ike stared for a moment, a mix of exasperation and amusement playing on his face. "George," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching. "You don't look like a general." Patton, mud-spattered and defiant, simply grinned. "That's because I'm not acting like one, Ike. I'm acting like a soldier." This seemingly small encounter speaks volumes about one of America's most famous and often misunderstood generals. While most commanders operated from comfortable headquarters miles behind the lines, poring over maps and issuing orders by radio, Patton was different. He believed a general belonged at the front, not for an occasional morale visit, but constantly. His habit of dressing like his men, working alongside them, and appearing where no general had any business being, made him almost unrecognizable, even to the Supreme Allied Commander himself. It's how the flamboyant, larger-than-life Patton became nearly invisible at the front, and why that made him one of the most effective commanders of World War II. To understand why this encounter truly matters, we need to grasp the fundamental difference between how most generals operated and Patton's unique approach. In World War II, commanding a modern army was an extraordinarily complex task. You were coordinating thousands of men, hundreds of vehicles, constant supply movements, air support, artillery, and vital intelligence. This demanded maps, sophisticated communications equipment, a dedicated staff, and secure facilities. Naturally, this led to commanding from the rear. Most American Army and Corps commanders established headquarters 10, 20, sometimes even 30 miles behind the front lines, close enough to respond to changes, yet far enough to be safe from artillery and sudden enemy breakthroughs. It was practical, logical, and the accepted way modern military operations were supposed to work. Generals planned, officers executed, soldiers fought. Patton, however, thought this was pure nonsense. He firmly believed you couldn't truly understand a battle from a map. You had to see it, feel it, smell the cordite and burning oil, hear the machine guns, and witness firsthand how terrain actually affected movement instead of just guessing from contour lines. More importantly, he believed American soldiers fought harder when they knew their general was right there with them, not safely in the rear, but up front, taking the same risks. So, Patton spent an absurd amount of time at the front. His staff officers, perpetually stressed, went grey trying to keep track of him. He'd vanish from headquarters for hours, sometimes showing up at battalion or even company command posts without any warning. And he certainly didn't dress the part. Most generals wore impeccable uniforms, perfectly polished boots, all their rank insignia proudly visible. You could spot a general from 100 yards away, which was partly the point. Soldiers were supposed to recognize and salute their superior officers. Patton, however, when at the front, often wore a plain helmet without rank markings, a standard field jacket that was frequently muddy or oil-stained. Sometimes he'd even carry a rifle instead of just a sidearm. He looked like a field-grade officer, a major or a lieutenant colonel, not a three-star general. This wasn't an affectation or a theatrical costume. Patton genuinely believed in being where the fighting was, and he understood that looking like everyone else made soldiers more comfortable talking to him honestly about problems and conditions. It also made him a very difficult target for German snipers who were specifically trained to identify and eliminate officers, especially high-ranking ones. The specific encounter with Eisenhower happened during one of Patton's typical frontline excursions. His Third Army was advancing rapidly through France. Units were spread across multiple axes of advance, communications were chaotic, radio nets were overloaded, and phone lines were being laid as fast as units could move forward. Patton, ever the man of action, decided the only way to truly know what was happening was to go see for himself. So, he grabbed an aide, hopped into a jeep, and drove straight to where his forward units were supposed to be. What he found was typical war. Vehicles broken down, soldiers exhausted but pushing forward, junior officers making critical decisions without orders because there simply wasn't time to wait for instructions from headquarters. At one point, Patton came across a half-track stuck deep in the mud. Its crew was trying to free it, but in Patton's expert opinion, he had spent decades studying everything from tank mechanics to engineering. They were doing it wrong. So, he got out of his jeep and immediately started helping, barking instructions, arguing with a sergeant about cable placement, and getting mud all over himself. This was vintage Patton. He simply couldn't see a problem without trying to fix it personally. While he was elbow-deep in mud and cursing at a winch cable, Eisenhower's convoy arrived. Ike was on one of his characteristic inspection tours, visiting forward areas to assess morale and gather input. Eisenhower's style was markedly different from Patton's. He dressed properly. His visits were meticulously organized. He met with senior commanders, reviewed operational plans, and inspected facilities. He was visible and recognizable, the supreme commander making his presence felt. So, when Eisenhower stepped out of his staff car and saw what looked like a lieutenant colonel arguing with enlisted men about vehicle recovery, he barely gave it a second glance. Just another officer doing his job. He started walking towards where he thought the command post would be. Then Patton said something, probably something profane about the half-track, or the mud, or both. And Eisenhower froze. He knew that voice. He'd heard it countless times in staff meetings, in arguments, in planning sessions, going all the way back to their time in North Africa. He turned back and really looked at the muddy officer for the first time. The helmet came off. It was definitely Patton. Eisenhower's reaction was a potent mix of exasperation, amusement, and genuine surprise. "George, you don't look like a general." Patton's response, "That's because I'm not acting like one, Ike. I'm acting like a soldier," perfectly encapsulated his entire philosophy of command. It wasn't a joke. Patton genuinely believed that being a general meant being a better soldier than everyone else, not sitting in comfort while others did the fighting. He had a saying he repeated to his staff constantly: lead from the front, not command from the rear or direct from headquarters, lead from the front. This belief stemmed deeply from his exhaustive study of military history. Patton was an obsessive reader of military campaigns going back to ancient times. He'd studied Alexander the Great, who fought personally in every battle, Julius Caesar, who wrote about crossing rivers with his soldiers, Napoleon, who routinely exposed himself to enemy fire to inspire his troops. The great commanders, Patton believed, were those who shared danger with their men, who truly understood what they were asking soldiers to do because they were willing to do it themselves. There was also a very practical element to his approach. Patton didn't trust second-hand reports. He'd seen too many situations where officers gave overly rosy assessments because they didn't want to admit problems, or where reports were simply wrong because nobody had actually checked the facts on the ground. If Patton wanted to know if a road could handle tank traffic, he drove it himself. If he wanted to know if a bridge could support armor, he inspected it personally. If he wanted to know if his troops had adequate supplies, he showed up at a company mess to see what they were actually eating. His staff found this utterly exhausting. Keeping track of Patton was a full-time job in itself. He'd tell them he was going to one location, then spontaneously change his mind and go somewhere completely different. He'd even visit units that weren't under his direct command, simply because he wanted to see how they were doing. But the soldiers loved it. Stories spread quickly through the ranks. Patton was at the 3rd Battalion yesterday, helping push a truck out of a ditch. Patton showed up at our position last night, asked if we needed anything. Patton chewed out a supply officer personally when our ammunition didn't arrive. This created a profound loyalty, not the kind of loyalty you order or demand, but the kind you earn by showing soldiers you care enough to be right there with them. The encounter with Eisenhower highlighted a fundamental contrast in leadership styles, both incredibly effective but completely different. Eisenhower commanded through meticulous organization, careful planning, and expert coalition management. His immense job required him to think strategically, balance competing demands from multiple armies and nations, navigate complex logistics and political pressures, and always keep the big picture in focus. He couldn't afford to get caught up in the details of individual battles. If he spent his time visiting frontline units, he'd lose sight of the overall campaign. His place was at SHAEF headquarters, where he could see everything and make informed, overarching decisions. This was the conventional wisdom of modern warfare. Wars had become too complex for commanders to lead from the front. You needed distance and perspective. But Patton represented an older tradition, one that deeply valued personal leadership and direct observation over administrative efficiency. He believed you couldn't truly understand a situation from reports and maps, that something vital was always lost in translation between the front lines and headquarters. Both approaches had immense merit. Eisenhower's organizational genius kept the Allied coalition functioning despite enormous tensions and competing interests, and his big-picture thinking shaped strategy across the entire European theater. But Patton's frontline presence created a different kind of effectiveness. His units advanced faster, fought harder, and maintained morale even under the most difficult conditions, because soldiers knew their commander was truly with them. The encounter near the half-track perfectly embodied this difference. Eisenhower, impeccably dressed and clearly identifiable as the supreme commander, representing authority and organization. Patton, muddy and almost anonymous, representing personal leadership and shared hardship. Neither was wrong. They were just fighting the war in powerfully different ways. But for that brief moment, Eisenhower got a revealing glimpse of why Patton's Third Army moved faster and hit harder than any other American force in Europe. Because their commander wasn't just giving orders from the rear, he was there with them in the mud, helping push stuck vehicles out of ditches. It's important to note that Patton's frontline presence wasn't without controversy or significant risk. Multiple times during the war, Patton came under enemy fire, not because he was seeking glory, but because he consistently put himself in positions where combat was actively happening. German artillery didn't distinguish between three-star generals and privates. In Sicily, Patton was nearly killed when German aircraft strafed a column he was traveling with. In France, he was frequently close enough to German positions that enemy fire sometimes hit near his location. His staff was constantly terrified that they'd have to report to Eisenhower that Patton had been killed doing something utterly reckless. Bradley, Patton's superior during much of the European campaign, worried about this constantly. He'd order Patton to stay back, to command from appropriate headquarters, to stop taking unnecessary risks. Patton would agree, then promptly disappear to the front again the very next day. There was also the legitimate question of whether Patton's style was actually necessary or simply his personal preference. Other successful commanders, like Bradley himself, or Matthew Ridgway, or J. Lawton Collins, commanded effectively without Patton's constant frontline presence. They maintained excellent morale, achieved their objectives, and didn't risk getting killed visiting forward positions. But Patton's defenders argue that his style produced unique and undeniable results. Third Army's advance across France was faster than any other Allied force. His units consistently achieved objectives ahead of schedule, and soldier morale in Third Army was measurably higher than in other formations. Was that because of Patton's frontline leadership? Or would Third Army have been just as effective with a more conventional commander? We'll never know for certain, but the American soldiers who served under Patton absolutely believed it mattered. They told stories about seeing him at the front for the rest of their lives. They felt that having a general who'd share their danger made them fight harder, endure more, and believe that victory was possible even when things looked bleak. When Eisenhower said, "You don't look like a general," he was commenting on more than just Patton's muddy uniform. He was recognizing that Patton had chosen a completely different path than most commanders, that he'd rejected the comfortable distance of modern command in favor of personal, visible leadership. Patton's response, "I'm not acting like one, I'm acting like a soldier," captured his fundamental belief that rank was responsibility, not privilege, that leadership meant being first in danger, not last, that you couldn't ask men to risk their lives unless you were willing to risk yours. Was he entirely right? That's certainly debatable. Plenty of generals commanded successfully from headquarters. The modern military proved you could wage war effectively through organization and technology rather than solely personal heroism. But there's no question that Patton's soldiers believed in him in a way that's rare in military history. They followed him through seemingly impossible situations because they knew he was there with them. And sometimes, in the chaos of war, that belief, that unwavering faith in leadership, makes all the difference between victory and defeat. If you enjoyed this look at Patton's unconventional leadership style, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment below. What other moments of unexpected command encounters should I cover? Thanks for watching. Remember, the most effective leaders aren't always the ones who look the part.